Many research are showing that an absence of fatherhood has a catastrophic reverberations in the home, church, and society. Friends, let's be honest. Sometimes the parenting feels like the most wonderful duty in the world. Other times it feels like the worst. Yet one of the greatest needs in today's world is for men to assume the biblical responsibility of being godly fathers. As we reflect on the profound influence of fathers, I'm reminded of King David. Although he was a great king and the sweet psalmist of Israel, he struggled to be a good and godly father. King David is an example of how complicated godly parenting can be. The way he dealt with his sons Ammon, Absalom, and Adonijah caused him to experience some of the worst trial of his life. Today, we are briefly looking to some aspects, both negative and positive, of his fatherhood. Let's start with what he did wrong. David neglected his role as a father. His inconsistencies as a father were vividly displayed in the way he lacked to discipline his children Ammon, Absalom, and Adonijah. Let's start with 2 Samuel chapter 13, where David neglected his responsibility to execute justice when his son Ammon raped his half-sister Tamar. Ammon was lustful, immature, and violent. It's the example on how an undisciplined child had grown into an evil man. The further results of David's abdication of discipline was that his other son, Absalom, became hardened and embittered against his father's lack of justice. Absalom was seeking revenge by himself and eventually killed his own brother Ammon and fled from his father for a different time. David did not deal in the right way with Absalom's heart, so his son's bitterness remained in his heart, although he was banned from his presence. It eventually led to Absalom's rebellions and final death. David's regular failure to discipline his children is highlighted also with in regards of his son Adonijah. In 1 Kings chapter 1 verse 6 says this, that his father had never at any time displeased him by asking, "Why have you done thus and so?" He was also a very handsome man, and he was born next after Absalom. David indulged Adonijah. He was afraid to displease him. And for this reason, he failed to correcting and training him when he was needed to be disciplined. The result was a spoiled, disobedient son who eventually turned into an entitled young man. Friends, David knew about the evil of his children, yet neglected to restrain and correct them. Fathers must discipline their children. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. As we look at David's life, we see that he was not always a good example to his children. Ammon's, Absalom's, and Adonijah's sins reflected David's sins. David himself was greedy, sexually immoral, committing adultery with Bathsheba, a murderess, having her husband Uriah killed. Friends, integrity of character is fundamental because a father must not only teach his children what to do, but he must also show them how it's done. Otherwise, a child will see a hypocrite. Yet, despite all of this, David is a wonderful example of hope for those of us who may have struggled in their fatherhood role. 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 1 to 4 records the excellent advices and guidance David gave to his son Solomon at the end of his life. After learning from his own mistakes, David taught Solomon things that are important for fathers to pass on their own children. So David encouraged Solomon to be godly. As David was closer to die, he seemed to know very well the character of his son Solomon, and that he especially needed strength. Therefore, he commanded him to assume his own responsibility and be the man God wanted him to be. David taught Solomon the truth about life. In 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, we read, "When David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man." For fathers, it's very important at a certain age to recommend their children and to teaching them the truth about life, gender responsibility, death, and eternity. They need the support, the encouragement to fulfill God's calling for their life and their role as true adults in this present world. Fathers, let me be quite frank with you. Your children won't probably hear godly advice and important messages from their peers or their culture. They need to hear it from you. Knowing his son Solomon, David warned them of the dangers of failing in a real relationship with God. David told Solomon to honor God and obey him. In 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 3, he says, "And keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do, and wherever you turn." Sadly, Solomon did not listen to this until the end of his life, and he became one of the more tragic figures of the Old Testament. David taught Solomon that he had a place in God's plan. He told Solomon in the following verse, chapter 2, verse 4, the first king, that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, "If your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel." David reminded Solomon that God's promises were not only for himself, but for his descendants, and therefore, now Solomon had the responsibility to carry them forward. Friends, we don't have the same specific promise David had, but we have a spiritual legacy to pass on to our children. Our sons and daughters need to hear from us that God has a plan for their lives and a calling to fulfill. So, as I'm going to conclude, as we look back to King David, his failures showed the need for a perfect king and a perfect father. The true Son of David, Jesus Christ, came to show us the one true and perfect Father in heaven, who is longing to fellowship with his beloved children. Fathers, the most crucial aspect of your role is your relationship with God, because by embodying the heart of God, you will become a beacon of hope and assurance for your family, demonstrating that with God, all things are possible. So may this be my final thoughts today. And with these thoughts, I wish all the blessing of God. May God richly bless you and keep you always.